So here we're going to look at what's called the Stakeholder Theory of the corporation, specifically at an article by Thomas Donaldson and Lee Preston, where they try to actually pull together some implicit theses of the stakeholder theory of the corporation in various published material. And they not only try to describe what exactly it is, they try to provide evidence for it, conceptualize it, and also justifications for it. So we're going to be looking at a brief account then of what the stakeholder theory of the corporation is through their conceptualization. So the more prominent theory prior to the stakeholder theory, which is of course now the most prominent theory of the corporation, is the shareholder theory, and then also the input-output theory, which is very similar to the shareholder theory, perhaps almost the same. It's only small differences. So the shareholder theory says that everything the firm does is for the sake of investors, that what a business is an entity which seeks to maximize the value of shareholders. So shareholders, of course, invest in a company and they expect returns, so profit from their investment. And we can see here in this graph the way that actually for the input-output theory, you have suppliers, investors, and employees, which all give into the firm. So perhaps the labor time from the employees, goods from suppliers, perhaps from investors, capital, and all of that is meant to then produce value for customers. Now, this is what the input-output theory says, is that investors, employees, and suppliers all contribute to the firm for the sake of the customers. But the reason why the shareholder theory and the input-output theory are pretty similar is that even if this is the case, even if they all produce value for the sake of the customers, that producing for the sake of the customers is supposed to ultimately return on investment for the investors, so to produce profit from revenue which the customers pay. So you want a product which customers are willing to buy. So in one sense, it's for what you do as a firm or a business is for customers, but on the other hand, it's also, of course, kind of the necessary factor is the implementation of capital or you need capital resources, which then in a capitalistic model means that, of course, the surplus value always goes back to the shareholders or the investors. So there's two ways to look at this model. One is, again, the input-output theory, so everything is done for the sake of the customer, or the shareholder theory that even if it's done for the sake of the customer, ultimately it's because investors want to make money from what they do for the customer. The stakeholder theory varies from this because it says actually there are an amalgamation of interests that people have in a firm, and then that firm has in those various groups of people, and that actually they all have equal weight. So the stakeholder theory of the corporation says that a business is an entity whereby all persons or groups with legitimate interests in that entity or that organization, they participate with it or are related to it or are affected by it because there are certain benefits that are gained over others. So we have here the firm where you can see arrows that go in and out, actually. So it's in a sense reciprocal with the stakeholder theory, whereby the customers are affected by the firm, but they also then affect the firm. Suppliers are affected by the firm, but they also affect the firm. Same thing with investors and employees. But the difference here now is we can also see it includes potentially political groups. So maybe lobbyist organizations or things like that. Governments. So there's a certain relationship between businesses and governments. Trade associations, maybe like unions, for example, as well as communities. The way that communities are impacted by businesses and the way in which, of course, they impact the potential success of a business. Now, the way they conceptualize it, the authors of this piece, is that all have an equal weight, an equal concern in the business, and all therefore are legitimate in and of themselves, right? So there's no determining criterion which can weight, the customers over the investors or the investors over the trade associations, and so what so have you. There are those some models of the stakeholder theory of the corporation, which have primary stakeholders and secondary stakeholders. What this would look like is that the primary stakeholders, so those which are first and foremost affected by the business, and the one then that a business has the most concern for, are investors, suppliers, customers, and employees. Then the secondary stakeholders, so after you consult and you think about the impact of what you need to do to serve the interests of the investors, suppliers, customers, and employees, then weighted secondarily would be communities, political groups, governments, and trade associations. So those are two different ways to actually look at the stakeholder theory of the corporation. And it makes sense, of course, because one thing that's gained from this view is this idea of social responsibility, that we can look at, well, we know there are empirical effects that businesses might have, both good and bad. Some businesses can actually bring well-being to a community. Some businesses can also potentially, pollute and bring harm to a community. And so what one of the insights of this theory is it shows the way in which then whatever an organization is, we have to include then all those that are affected by it, all those then that can have some claim to a legitimate interest in that organization. And in some way then they have to be represented when we discuss what is that organization, what are its interests, why does it exist. So there are three theses the authors put forward of the stakeholder theory. One is that the stakeholder theory is descriptive. So it presents a model describing what the corporation is. And it says that a corporation is a constellation of cooperative and competitive interests possessing intrinsic value. So all one needs to do then to prove, of course, the descriptive theory is actually look into the world, right? If one wants to know, this metaphysical question, what is a corporation? Well, the stakeholder theory provides you with that. But the stakeholder theory is also instrumental. So it establishes a framework for examining the connections between the practice of stakeholder management and the achievement of various corporate performance goals. So if you are, let's say, a CEO, okay, or in management, right, and you want to know, this new business policy, is this going to in fact affect anyone in a positive or negative way? Well, you can look at, okay, what are the relationships? What are the interests of this business? Should I pursue this business model over a different business model? Right? So there are ways in which the stakeholder theory allows you to consider, okay, who's going to be affected by this? If I want to propose a new, operation in the business for the sake of the customers, how might I, best go in doing this? And I can consider then the other stakeholders that might be involved and the ways in which they can contribute then to the goal of benefiting customers or other things like that, right? So there's a kind of a hypothetical use, right? If you want X, then the stakeholder theory can help show you should do Y, or potentially Z, or whatever else, right? Finally, the stakeholder theory is normative, and it is the argument of the authors that the normative theory is the most fundamental base of stakeholder theory, because it's all fine and well to, of course, observe what a corporation is and observe how best then, as let's say a manager, to operate in a corporation. But one wants to know, of course, in philosophy, what should a corporation do? Perhaps, this is what a corporation is, but is this actually what then it should be doing? Perhaps the corporation should change. Perhaps its goals should be different. So there are two aspects involved then in the normative theory of the stakeholder theory of the corporation. One, of course, is that stakeholders are identified by their interests, not necessarily the interests of the corporation, but by those people affected by the corporation. The second thing is that the interests of all stakeholders then are of intrinsic value, that because they are all affected then or identified by their interests in the corporation, they all have intrinsic value for the corporation. Now, one would then want to ask, why should stakeholder theory be accepted or preferred over alternative conceptions like the shareholder theory or the input-output theory of the corporation? So the authors give three brief justifications. So one is that the descriptive justifications attempt to show that the concepts embedded in the theory, the stakeholder theory, correspond to observed reality, that we should prefer the stakeholder theory because we can actually look at a corporation and see, hey, these are all the people that demonstrate, empirically that they have interest in the corporation or that they are affected by the corporation. The instrumental justification is that, hey, if we then apply this theory and a manager wants to, let's say, increase profit, and if they use the stakeholder theory, we can look and see they actually then increase profit by taking into account the stakeholder theory as opposed to the shareholder theory. And one of the reasons might be that the public is more likely to buy from a company that they perceive to be taking into account the interests of the consumers or the interests of a community, as opposed to a company that only abides by, perhaps the shareholder theory of the corporation, where the company only cares about making profit. Finally, the normative justification attempts to appeal to underlying concepts such as individual or group rights. So this could be from potentially virtue ethics or deontology, social contract theory, or utilitarianism. So we're going to look at this later, but we have to look at each of these different theories to see whether or not they lend normative justification to the stakeholder theory of the corporation. But one thing we can do in saying that we need to look at these normative justifications in their own right is to look at the way in which then the normative justification is nested within the overall stakeholder theory of the corporation. So the authors of the article say that while all three aspects of stakeholder theory are actually nested within each other, it is the normative theory which is the most fundamental. That if you want to disprove or prove the stakeholder theory of the corporation, you need to interrogate the various normative theories that might be used to justify the stakeholder theory of the corporation.